Some bands function like true democracies. Think of the band or Grateful Dead, where multiple voices and personalities helped shape the sound. But there are also bands where the other members gradually seem to serve the vision of one dominant frontman. Think of Dire Straits or Creedence Clearwater Revival. And honestly, at first glance, the Police could easily seem to fall into that second category. After all, Sting was not only the voice and face of the band, he also wrote the biggest hits. But the Police were far more than just a backing band built around Sting. Drummer and co-founder Stewart Copeland and guitarist Andy Summers had far more musical depth to offer than many people might expect. During their relatively short time together as the Police, they wrote 20 songs in which Sting had little to no creative involvement. And today, we're ranking exactly those so-called non-Sting Police songs. The catalog of the Police can roughly be divided into a few different categories. The most famous one is, of course, Sting's collection of hit songs. His songwriting put the band on the map and almost single-handedly turned the Police into chart dominators throughout their short career. But the fact that the Police truly operated as a band is perhaps heard best in their collective compositions, often instrumental jams that perfectly showcase the musicianship of all three members. There are also a handful of co-written songs, where Sting handled the lyrics while Stewart Copeland or Andy Summers composed the music. And then you have the songs in which Sting had no involvement at all, the so-called non-Sting Police songs. And these are definitely not throwaway tracks with all the tension removed. These are definitely not songs where the sting has been taken out. Pun intended. If anything, many of these songs are overlooked, but certainly no less worthwhile. So let's take a deep dive into them. Andy Summers already had a musical career long before joining the Police, playing in bands such as Zoot Money's Big Roll Band, The Animals, and Soft Machine. A pretty impressive resume, so expectations are naturally high. But I have to admit, we are not exactly getting off to a flying start here, because anyone who remembers last week's album ranking may recall that I crowned Mother by Andy Summers as the single worst Police song in the band's entire catalog. A bizarre, almost monstrous track that deliberately takes a chainsaw to the otherwise magnificent Synchronicity album. A genuine skip track. Precisely because this album contains such an overwhelming amount of strong, and especially catchy, material, Mother feels like it landed from a completely different planet. But maybe that is exactly the point. This is not a song trying to seduce the listener. It feels more like an anti-song, written specifically to create discomfort. And those kinds of contrarian experiments happen to fit Andy Summers perfectly. There is also something wonderfully ironic about the fact that one of the most commercially successful albums of the 1980s still made room for such a bizarre anti-hit. Summers probably enjoyed that immensely. His typically dry British sense of humor suddenly takes on an almost sinister edge here. And Mother is anything but a loving tribute to the woman who was his landlord for 9 months. I am a huge admirer of Andy's guitar playing and solo work, but for me this remains an absolute low point in the Police catalog. A friend of mine once used this song as the ringtone whenever his mother called. That I can appreciate, although it does make me wonder what kind of relationship he had with his mother. Less suffocating than Mother, I also consider the instrumental Behind My Camel to be a waste of valuable playing time, and perfectly good vinyl. The atmosphere is dark, mysterious, and unsettling, but to me the track mostly feels like a dead end. In fact, it sounds like exactly the kind of thing you would find behind a camel. It drags itself forward without ever really building toward anything meaningful. Remarkably, the song did win a Grammy Awards for Best Rock Instrumental Performance at the time, although personally I cannot really hear why. Sting was reportedly no fan of the track either. According to legend, he even refused to record the bass part, forcing Andy Summers to play it himself in the end. And as if that was not enough, A story has circulated for years claiming that Sting buried the original recording tape somewhere in the garden of Whistleord Studios in an attempt to stop the song from appearing on Zenyatta Mondatta. Unfortunately for Sting, the track still made it onto the album anyway. What makes the whole situation even more ironic is the fact that Sting apparently had a bigger problem with Behind My Camel, a song that more or less sounds like what you might expect to find behind a camel, than with Andy Summers' later nightmare opus, Mother. We are staying with Andy Summers for a little longer, because he was also responsible for Friends, an outtake from the Ghost in the Machine sessions in which his typically dry British humor is once again fully intact. Summers approaches the subject of cannibalism here in an almost absurdly detached way, casually suggesting that eating your friends is actually the ultimate act of love. When his time comes, his loved ones are more than welcome to feast on his body, as far as he is concerned. And somehow, only Andy Summers could present such a deeply morbid subject, as if he were simply commenting on the weather. You can probably also understand immediately why this song was ultimately left off of Ghost in the Machine, an album on which the Police was increasingly shifting away from being a democratic trio and moving toward a band more and more dominated by Sting's creative vision. Before Stewart Copeland co-founded the Police together with Sting, he played in the progressive rock band Curved Air. And although Copeland had been writing songs for the Police since the very beginning, in fact, the band's earliest singles were written by him. Contact marks one of his first fully developed songwriting contributions on a regular studio album by the band, admittedly sung by Sting, but entirely written by Copeland himself. On the early Police albums, there was still clearly much more room for Stewart and Andy Summers to contribute their own compositions, and Contact is a good example of that. Interestingly enough, Regatta de Blanc actually contains quite a bit of Stewart Copeland material. That may also have something to do with the enormous time pressure surrounding the album. After all, only 11 months separated debut album Outlandos d'Amour and follow-up album Regatta de Blanc, while the band was also touring heavily during that same period. As I already mentioned in the album ranking episode, some songs from this era almost feel like tour bus songs, compositions written on the road or under significant pressure, because A&M Records wanted to capitalize on the band's momentum as quickly as possible. And honestly, you can sometimes hear that as well, because while Contact is absolutely a solid track, it ultimately lives in the shadow of gigantic Regatta de Blanc Police classics, such as Message in a Bottle and Walking on the Moon. Stewart Copeland was certainly capable of writing sharp and biting songs, but on Contact, he ultimately has to acknowledge Sting as the stronger songwriter. From that same category of tour bus songs, and taken from the very same album, Regatta de Blanc, comes It's All Right for You by Stewart Copeland. The rhythmic phrasing of the lyrics works especially well here, and gives the song a surprisingly infectious energy. Still, this track also ultimately has to bow to the absolute classics surrounding it on the album. And with Regatta de Blanc, those classics are not even limited to the major hit singles. The album is also packed with strong, deep cuts and hidden gems among the regular album tracks. Personally, I would place It's All Right for You just outside that category. But it unquestionably remains a fun, energetic, and highly enjoyable Police song. At number 15, we find one of the very first officially released Police songs, featuring Andy Summers as a band member. In 1977, Summers replaced original guitarist Henry Padovani and immediately gave the band a massive musical upgrade. Dead End Job, written by Stewart Copeland and Andy Summers and released as the B-side to Can't Stand Losing You, is a wonderfully neurotic and rough-edged punk track from the earliest era of the Police, before their sound began shifting more decisively toward reggae and new wave influences. The Police were never a pure punk band, but these early songs absolutely carried that kind of energy. Fast, chaotic, aggressive, and unruly. Exactly the way a proper punk song should sound. The band tears through the track at full speed while Sting furiously screams that he does not want a dead-end job. Ironically enough, He also sings about not wanting to become a teacher, despite the fact that he actually worked as one before joining the police. We even hear Sting swearing here, something that is remarkably rare not only within the police catalog, but also throughout much of his later solo career. And as if the song did not already sound nervous enough, a hysterical siren-like noise suddenly appears while Andy Summers starts monotonously reading job advertisements out loud. It almost sounds as if the classified pages of a British newspaper have been transformed into performance art, like a completely mentally exhausted civil servant slowly losing his final scraps of willpower somewhere between the employment listings. Outlandos d'Amour contains one of the strangest moments in the entire police catalog in the form of Be My Girl, Sally. What begins as an infectious and fairly conventional Sting song suddenly transforms into absurdist theater when Andy Summers completely hijacks the track with a spoken word monologue. In a wonderfully dry and deadpan manner, Summers explains how dramatically his quality of life improved once Sally entered his world. Although it is probably important to mention that Sally does not turn out to be a real woman, but rather an inflatable sex doll. The entire piece feels as if someone accidentally edited a Monty Python sketch into the middle of a police song. Summers' unmistakably British sense of humor is woven all throughout the track and genuinely comes remarkably close to the same kind of absurdist comedy that made John Cleese and the rest of Monty Python famous. Stewart Copeland wrote Bombs Away, a song that appears on Zenyatta Mondatta. At first glance, it sounds like a fairly innocent and almost cheerful police track, wrapped inside an enormously catchy melody. But appearances can be deceiving. Beneath that lightness lies a surprisingly dark sense of humor. The lyrics describe, among other things, an army general who develops romantic feelings for a guerrilla girl. His job pays well, but his officers stink. And the president in the second verse does not come across much better either. Neatly dressed shirt and tie, while the country slowly drifts toward disaster. Bombs away, but we're okay, Sting sings with an almost disturbingly casual indifference. As if the entire world is on fire, yet nobody really seems to care anymore. That contrast between infectious pop energy and underlying alienation makes Bombs Away one of the strangest, and at the same time most effective, Stewart Copeland compositions in the police catalog. The other ones are complete bullshit. You want something corny? You got it. With those words, Stewart Copeland opens On Any Other Day. And immediately, the tone is perfectly established. His dry and understated sense of humor shines throughout a song about a man who simply seems destined for bad luck. Everything goes wrong. His wife burns the scrambled eggs, the dog bites his leg, his daughter runs away, and apparently his son is causing existential confusion as well. And it would be okay on any other day, Copeland sings with wonderfully exhausted resignation. Because sometimes absolutely everything seems to work against you at once. Regatta de Blanc contains several Stewart Copeland compositions, but this is without question one of the funniest. The entire song almost feels like British sitcom misery translated into music. Stewart Copeland is given the honor of closing Zenyatta Mondatta, and he does so entirely on his own terms. The Other Way of Stopping is an instrumental track driven almost completely by the unique, nervous, and hyperactive drumming style for which Copeland became famous. The song is remarkably catchy, energetic, and constantly in motion. And of the two instrumental tracks on Zenyatta Mondatta, the other being Behind My Camel, this is quite clearly the stronger composition, where Behind My Camel prioritizes atmosphere over structure. The Other Way of Stopping feels lively, focused, and purposeful. The Police were, first and foremost, a band built around strong songwriting and pop structures. But the moment those fixed frameworks disappear and the group is given more room to play freely, you really begin to hear just how absurdly talented these three musicians actually were together as a band. We are officially entering the top 10, And we are staying in instrumental jam territory for a little while longer because Andy Summers' Sham Bell lands at number 10. The track was recorded during the Ghost in the Machine sessions and eventually appeared as the B-side to Invisible Sun. The song carries that same dark, simmering, and mysterious atmosphere that hangs over much of the Ghost in the Machine album. And Andy Summers' guitar playing especially shines throughout the track. What immediately stands out is the way he paints with sound without ever descending into pure technical showmanship. Summers was never a stereotypical guitar hero or flashy fretboard warrior, trying to impress people with speed or endless solos. Instead, he almost always chose his own musical path, one that could sometimes feel nearly impossible to follow. And that is precisely why he still sounds completely unique within rock music to this day. At number 9, we find Fallout, the official debut single by The Police. Back when the band still consisted of Sting, Stewart Copeland, and original guitarist Henry Padovani. This is The Police in full punk mode, fast, raw, nervous, and urgent. Commercially, the single barely made an impact at the time, but during the band's early years, it gradually became a regular fixture in their live shows. Stewart Copeland wrote the song as one of the very first compositions for The Police, and at that point, nobody could possibly have imagined that this scrappy little punk band would evolve into one of the biggest groups in the world only a few years later. The rest, of course, is history. The B-side of Fallout appears one spot higher on the list. And if you already considered Fallout fast and dirty, Nothing Achieving pushes things even further. The song sounds even faster, even more aggressive, and radiates pure punk frustration aimed directly at the establishment. The tense relationship between father and son especially takes a beating here. Sting's voice cuts straight through the mix like a knife, while the Police charge forward in an almost chaotic fashion. Everything about the track feels restless, hyperactive, and urgent. The Police would later evolve further and further toward reggae, new wave, and more refined pop structures, but they would never again sound quite as uncompromisingly vicious as they do on this early Stewart Copeland punk composition. Stewart Copeland was also responsible for A Sermon, a song that sounds considerably catchier than Nothing Achieving, while still retaining the nervous punk energy of the early Police years. Sharp, bitter, and filled with venom, the track takes aim at people who manipulate, exploit, and mistreat others for personal gain. Despite its aggressive undertone, the song remains surprisingly accessible and melodic. In fact, this is exactly the kind of track that makes you wonder why it ultimately ended up as merely a B-side. A Sermon could easily have earned a place on Zenyatta Mandata without any trouble whatsoever. No excuse. Stewart Copeland's most significant songwriting contribution to the massive hit album Synchronicity is Miss Gridenko. Who or what Miss Gridenko actually represents, we will probably never fully know. But where Michael Jackson famously wondered in Smooth Criminal whether Annie was okay, Stewart Copeland seems primarily concerned here with the fate of Miss Gridenko herself. Miss Gridenko, are you safe? Keeps returning throughout the song over a nervous yet remarkably light-footed arrangement. Although Stewart wrote the track, we mostly hear Sting handling the lead vocals, something that perfectly illustrates how, by the time of Synchronicity, the Police had increasingly become structured around Sting as the voice and face of the band. The fluid guitar arpeggios from Andy Summers especially give the song much-needed airiness, something the listener is secretly quite grateful for after first having to survive the nightmare that is Mother. Outside the context of the album, Miss Gridenko might not even seem like a particularly remarkable Police track. But within the sequencing of Synchronicity, it serves an absolutely crucial role. Positioned between the nightmare of Mother and the epic Synchronicity 2, it provides exactly the moment of breathing space the album desperately needs at that point. We are approaching the top 5 with an Andy Summers composition from the Synchronicity era. In an early demo stage, the song still carried the title Goodbye Tomorrow, but it was eventually renamed Someone to Talk to. The track portrays a man struggling with a broken relationship while slowly being consumed by loneliness. He tries to keep himself together, but gradually becomes trapped inside his own thoughts. If only he had someone to talk to, even if it were only to escape himself for a moment. Andy Summers is not a great vocalist, certainly not compared to Sting, but that restrained and emotionally distant style actually works remarkably well here. He delivers the lyrics without grand drama or theatrical outbursts, more in line with that classic British stiff upper lip mentality where the emotions quietly leak through the cracks rather than being openly displayed. Meanwhile, his guitar playing clearly reveals his love for jazz rock and fusion. His notes are never just riffs or solos, they almost sound like saxophone phrases translated onto guitar, because the phrasing and articulation are so unusual that parts of the performance genuinely feel more like a saxophone line than traditional rock guitar playing. And honestly, had Someone to Talk To appeared on Synchronicity instead of Mother, that album would have been practically flawless to me. At number 4, we find a collaboration between Stewart Copeland and Sting. Peanuts from Outlandos d'Amour. The song is energetic, nervous, and absurdly catchy. Sting's voice cuts straight through the music, while the Police once again demonstrate that in their earliest days, they were essentially creating a kind of melodic proto-punk. Everything about Peanuts sounds frantic and urgent, yet always driven by a strong sense of hooks and melody. Toward the end, the song gloriously descends into chaos when a barely identifiable wind instrument, possibly a melodica or a kazoo, suddenly starts forcing its way through the track in an almost free jazz-like manner, not floating above the music, but cutting directly through it. And that is exactly what gives the song its rough edges and nervous energy, the qualities that make those early Police tracks feel so alive. Regatta de Blanc contains more Stewart Copeland compositions than any other album in the entire Police catalog, and Does Everyone Stare unquestionably ranks among his strongest contributions, at the very least on that album. What begins as an almost fragile piano ballad with an angular and strangely timed backbeat slowly transforms into an uncomfortable and tragic love drama, complete with a sudden operatic soundbite that somehow makes the entire thing even stranger. The lyrics are filled with nervousness, anxiety, and social paranoia. We follow a man who becomes completely obsessed with a woman and gradually sabotages himself psychologically because of it. Not because there is anything wrong with her, but because his obsession grows so overwhelming that even a simple date begins to feel like a psychological nightmare. A man completely consumed by obsession toward a woman? Well, which later Police classic does that subject suddenly remind us of? Things are not exactly becoming more optimistic with the next Stewart Copeland composition, because his very best Police song also happens to be his darkest, appropriately titled Darkness. Ghost in the Machine contains an enormous number of highlights, and Darkness unquestionably stands among the album's most powerful moments. While much of the record moves forward with nervous energy and restless momentum, the final tracks on Side B finally seem to create a little breathing space. Secret Journey by Sting still sounds like a mysterious and emotionally distant epic, but it never quite reaches the emotional core. Darkness absolutely does, from the very first piano chords. The elastic bass riff immediately pulls the song into a hypnotic groove, while the lyrics feel painfully honest and emotionally exposed. In many ways, Darkness is essentially clinical depression trapped inside the skeleton of a pop song. And that is precisely what makes it so remarkable. A song dealing with such grim subject matter somehow still manages to sound warm, inviting, and strangely accessible at the same time. If you only listen casually, you could almost drift along to the song in a relaxed state. But anyone truly paying attention to the lyrics is confronted with a deeply unsettling glimpse inside the mind of someone being completely consumed by darkness. I wish I never woke up this morning. Life was easy when it was boring. The song offers no solutions and no answers. And yet, there is comfort hidden inside it. Perhaps precisely because while listening, you realize that you are not the only person desperately searching for light inside the darkness sometimes. For me, Darkness is the greatest song Stewart Copeland ever wrote during his years with the Police. Had this been released as a single, it probably would have become a hit. And if it had become a hit, it almost certainly would have ended up on the set list. And had it remained on the set list for years, far more people today would realize just how great Omega Man actually is. Because this is, without question, Andy Summers' absolute masterpiece. The greatest Police song that was never released as a single. Of course, Every Little Thing She Does Is Magic is an untouchable pop classic. But this explosive and irresistibly catchy rock song had at least as much potential to grow into a massive hit, which is exactly why the decision to release Invisible Sun as a single instead remains, to me, one of the strangest choices in the entire Police catalog. A beautiful song, absolutely, but commercially, a far less obvious choice. Even the less commercially sounding Secret Journey ended up receiving a single release in the United States and Canada. Ghost in the Machine is filled with highlights anyway. Spirits in the Material World, Every Little Thing She Does Is Magic, and of course, the number 2 entry on this list, Darkness. More than anything else, Andy Summers and Stewart Copeland prove one essential point here. The Police was far more than just Sting. Because without their contributions, this catalog would never have been nearly as interesting, versatile, or unpredictable. The songs Sting had no involvement in are sometimes strange, sometimes messy, sometimes experimental, but occasionally they are outright brilliant. And no song proves that better than Omega Man. And those were the 20 best non-Sting Police songs. The compositions of Stewart Copeland and Andy Summers, but what do you actually think about their contributions to the Police? And which track would take the number 1 spot on your own list? Let me know in the comments and vote in the poll. Listen to all 20 non-Sting Police songs through the Spotify playlist and visit the social media pages for all updates. Because I will follow you, if you follow me. Last week, I ranked every studio album by the Police. If you missed that episode, you can watch it right here. Click the card to see the video. Thanks for watching. See you next time. And in the meantime, drop the needle, press play, and remember, we're only in it for the music.